Hello and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to see so many of you joining us today. My name is Laura Schreik. I am the Senior Program Director of Business and Sustainability with the Council of the Great Lakes Region. The Council of the Great Lakes Region, for those of you who may not be familiar with us, is a binational nonprofit organization dedicated to deepening the U.S.-Canada relationship in the Great Lakes Economic Region and watershed. And we are a platform to facilitate knowledge sharing, like with today's webinar, and to foster region-wide communities of interest and act on some of the most pressing socioeconomic and environmental issues in the region. Connecting global and regional thought leadership and addressing such issues allows us to align synergies and best practice to solve real problems, not only facing the world, but the binational Great Lakes region. We have a very informative webinar for you today on a very important topic, water stewardship. And what perfect timing, because this week is World Water Week. As we get started, allow me to give you a little bit of background just to help set the stage for today's discussion. The North American binational Great Lakes region is guardian of the largest freshwater system in the world. This vital freshwater system sustains life for thousands of species and sustains a regional economy that rivals the biggest national economies in the world, from marine commerce and energy production. They play an incredibly important role in the well-being of the region's millions of residents, including providing drinking water for over 40 million Americans and Canadians. Water is vital to many of the industries that drive the region's robust economy. And with 20% of the Earth's surface fresh water, it is not uncommon for companies in the region to maybe mistakenly think they are resistant to the impact of today's global and continental water challenges. But as the world faces an alarming climate crisis, water resources in every region are impacted, including the Great Lakes region. The Great Lakes resources may appear to be abundant and endless, but the reality is they are not. They are finite and fragile, as are all of the region's rivers, lakes, and groundwater resources. And residents of the region, including and especially companies, carry a responsibility to ensure the valuable freshwater resources are used wisely and are protected. It is estimated that the Great Lakes region, which includes 8 US states and 2 Canadian provinces, has an aggregate average daily water consumption of 2,473 liters per person. To put that in perspective, the global target of freshwater consumption, the maximum sustainable value, is 1,522 liters. That's a difference of over 900 liters per person per day. And we are in trouble if we do not start using our freshwater resources wisely and certainly more sustainably, as only 1% of the Great Lakes are renewed annually by precipitation, runoff, and groundwater. And our water systems above and below ground are constantly at risk of pollution and depletion, with a rapidly changing climate worsening water stress. So during today's webinar, we will take a close look at the principles of water stewardship, discuss corporate responsibility with respect to water practices, explore the value of a verified water stewardship program, and learn what companies can do to understand their water use and assess their associated water risks. We are joined today by industry experts from the Water Council and BlueTriton brands who will share insight from their unique perspectives on corporate responsibility on water stewardship. We will close the webinar with a Q&A session after we hear from both of our guest speakers. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the Zoom Q&A box and we will do our best to get to them. I do ask that you use the Q&A box instead of the chat box. This just helps us keep better track of the questions as they come in, so we'd appreciate that. Before I introduce our first speaker from the Water Council, I am happy to share that the Council of the Great Lakes region and the Water Council have recently formalized a partnership that will help accelerate water innovation and stewardship in the binational Great Lakes region. The Water Council is a world-class hub dedicated to solving critical water challenges and advancing water stewardship. And together with them, we are working with companies across the Great Lakes sectors to ensure the region's water resources are protected and remain a competitive advantage. A component of this partnership is the creation of Great Lakes WISE, which stands for Water Innovation and Stewardship Exchange. Great Lakes WISE is a forum that will help deepen peer-to-peer conversations, policy research, and programs about water resources protection, best practices, and innovative solutions. Today's webinar is the first of many conversations that will be facilitated through Great Lakes WISE. The Water Council runs the Water Stewardship Verified program called WAVE, an initiative that helps companies understand their water uses and improve their water stewardship, which the Council of the Great Lakes region is proud to support. And we will be hearing more about WAVE from our first speaker, Matt Howard, Vice President of Water Stewardship at the Water Council. Matt oversees the Water Council's sustainability and stewardship initiatives, which initially focused on establishing the Alliance for Water Stewardship system globally with specific oversight of North America. He created the world's first professional credentialing program for water stewardship professionals and made the business case for use of the International Water Stewardship Standard in the North American marketplace. Matt now oversees the Water Council's corporate water stewardship programs and advisory services. He has over 15 years in sustainability program development and management, including 5 years as Milwaukee's sustainability director. Matt came to Milwaukee from Washington, D.C., where he worked at the U.S. Department of Commerce and as a staffer in the U.S. House of Representatives. He also served on the U.S. EPA's National Advisory Council on Environmental Policy and Technology from 2014 to 2019. Matt, you certainly bring a lot of experience to the table with you. So thank you very much for being here with us. And I will now hand the Zoom stage over to you.
Thanks, Laura. Appreciate it. Thanks for the introduction, and a welcome to everyone who's logged on this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're located. I think there'll be quite a few takeaways, both for myself and Ed, who's going to come up a little bit later when he talks about BlueTriton's experience with water stewardship. So Laura mentioned a little bit about the Water Council, just to maybe reiterate, briefly over a minute or two. Again, the Water Council is a nonprofit. We're headquartered in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We've been around for about 12 or 13 years. And really our goal, our mission is to work within our water sector and across different disciplines to identify technologies, innovations, and solutions and best practices that really help companies and even utilities as well, and others, address their water quality and quantity challenges. And so, as Laura mentioned, as Vice President of Water Stewardship of the Water Council, I'm obviously overseeing a lot of our water stewardship related work. And today I'm going to focus primarily on our new corporate water stewardship program called WAVE. But before I get into the specifics of the WAVE program, I just kind of want to pick up a thread or two in terms of Laura's intro and talk a little bit about why we at the Water Council have developed this program that you're going to hear about. I think, of course, we're all unfortunately too familiar these days with what's happening with our water resources. We all know climate change is no longer some philosophical event that may or may not happen in the future. It's happening now, and we're feeling it primarily through impacts to our water resources. It's mind-boggling, really, day over day, what's happening in the United States in particular, of course, globally, with drought, scarcity issues, flooding. seeing flooding and droughts in the same areas occurring at the same time, as is the case in Nevada and Las Vegas, for instance, recently, just over the past month or so. So when you look at this from a company lens or a company perspective, because that's really kind of where we're heading today with this webinar, and learning and hearing about BlueTriton's experience, again, as Laura mentioned, companies that are located here in the Great Lakes region, can't necessarily assume that they're immune from water-related risks. And again, those of us that live and work in the Great Lakes know all too well the different types of water-related risks that are here, from water quality issues to regulatory uncertainty as it relates to groundwater and maybe TMDLs and some other things, PFAS, for instance. So we know it's a relatively water risk environment, despite the fact that, as she said, we have nearly 20% of the world's surface freshwater reserves. So whether you're a company that's headquartered here in the Great Lakes, or you're sourcing from the Great Lakes region, or your supply chain or operations stretch across the region, water is an issue that you really need to pay attention to. So that's obviously kind of like the first point that you're going to hear from myself and Ed, as well as Laura. And so when it comes specifically to this idea around corporate water stewardship, and when we say corporate water stewardship, what we're really talking about is a company, an organization looking across the enterprise, all of its operations, looking at its supply chain and value chain to really better understand what its water uses and impacts are, what the associated risks are, and then as an organization set a strategic path based on that context to mitigate those risks, but also to address shared challenges and opportunities. So it's really kind of taking a systems or macro approach to water stewardship from the boardroom. And so kind of out there right now in water stewardship world, we've got sort of two poles of activity, if you will. One pole is really focused on the boardroom, the C-suite. So we've got things like the CEO Water Mandate and the Water Resilience Coalition, where we're seeing CEOs and others make commitments on behalf of companies and organizations to commit to water stewardship. And then at that other pole, we're seeing very specific site level work on water stewardship at factories and farms and commercial office buildings through the use of standards like the International Water Stewardship Standard, or ISO, or employing science-based targets. So we've got these two poles of activity in water stewardship world, but what's been missing in our view and our estimation at the Water Council is really kind of a connective thread, a connective strategic thread from the boardroom to the shop floor when it comes to water stewardship and operationalizing water stewardship. So that's kind of one phenomenon that we've been observing as an NGO in this space. The second thing that we're seeing quite a bit of lately is a lot of new entrants into water stewardship, from companies outside kind of the usual suspects of food and beverage, which is good. But we're also seeing a proliferation of goals and targets, which kind of leaves some questions, right? Especially around net positive, net zero as it relates to water. What do those targets and goals mean? And so, in conversation with other stakeholder groups, a lot of us are wondering, when companies are making some of these commitments, whether they are a net positive or net zero type goal, or even just a simple conservation goal, how did the company decide to get to that point? And are they actually mitigating some of the highest priority risks where they can have the most impact, and doing it at the right times in the right places? And so from the stakeholder perspective, we're really kind of feeling, again, we needed to develop an approach that added hopefully some credibility for companies as they develop a water strategy and as they set targets and goals. So that's what led us to develop this program that we're calling WAVE, Water Stewardship Verified. And just in terms of what it is, it's a multi-step program that's built on this idea or concept of continuous improvement. Again, because climatic conditions are going to change year over year, because conditions impacting our water resources are in constant flux, you need a continuous improvement approach to address water and water-related issues and risks. So it's a continuous improvement methodology that corporations can apply, and it really helps them expand their enterprise-wide risk radar as it relates to water uses and impacts. And ultimately, what we want is companies to use this process as a foundation to build a water strategy, again, that's directly responsive to the context of how they use and impact water and where they're located and where they operate. And so for us, like one of the outcomes of developing this program then is ensuring that as companies go through this, we and other stakeholders know that they're prioritizing water-related action where it matters most. And just as importantly, then they're communicating credibly and transparently about what those risks are and what they intend to do about it as a company. And then the last item as it relates to the development of this program that was really important for us is we spent 2 years developing this, spent the entirety of 2021 piloting this program with 4 companies. We kind of came out of the pilot in conversation with the companies and some of our advisors to the pilot, really determined that we needed to add an independent verification piece to this. So go through the steps of this program, but then at the end of the day, bring on a third-party auditor to really verify or confirm, the company's gone through those steps and is doing what they're saying that they're going to do as it relates to water and water stewardship. So we've partnered with SCS Global Services. They're a global leader in environmental and sustainability standards verification and certification. And so companies that sign on to our WAVE program, which just launched in February, and so BlueTriton is one of the first signatories to this program. When BlueTriton makes it through the steps of the WAVE program, then a requirement is that they go out and attempt to seek that independent verification from SCS Global Services. For those of you that may be interested in, say, the difference between verification and certification, if you've heard those two terms thrown about, certification typically, refers to a standard, and it requires a level of audit that is done in person. So there's an in-person component, maybe a desk component as well. So that's typically what we think of when we think of a certification audit for a standard. WAVE is not a standard, it's a protocol. And therefore we're using the independent verification process, which again, still a third-party audit, but because there's no actions actually happening at a site, again, this is more of an assessment and a risk assessment approach to eventually building that platform to act. We're doing the independent verification route with SCS Global Services. So just in terms of the WAVE methodology itself, it's a 6-step approach that helps companies basically identify and understand all their water uses and impacts across the enterprise. So if you've got a corporation that has retail and manufacturing, we want to know across, both of those business units or all their business units, again, how is water being impacted? How is water being used within those operations? So looking across the enterprise. If it's material and relevant for an organization, then also look within the supply chain or even within the value chain. And again, in terms of how water may be impacted and used, or how customers may use their products and therefore end up impacting water resources. So do that assessment, bring in a component of a watershed-based risk assessment to that. So then look on a location by location basis for those operations and assess overall water related risk. And then based on that, on those 2 assessment components, develop a policy and commitment statement for the company on water stewardship. And just as importantly, then do some prioritization around risk and action. Because ultimately, what I've witnessed too much of out there with companies in water stewardship in particular over the past number of years is like random acts of kindness, right? And so we've got very large companies impacting water resources globally. Let's add some strategic through line to that, from materiality to action. And let's help and ensure that companies are focusing their resources, their time, their labor, their money, et cetera, again, on doing the right things at the right times, at the right places when it comes to water stewardship. So that's why the prioritization step within WAVE is so important to us. And then at the end of the day, in terms of this program, in terms of WAVE itself, then have that company do some public communication around what it's learned going through this risk assessment process, and ultimately what it's going to prioritize and where it's going with its water commitments and actions in the coming years. And so we want that communicated, and we want, again, stakeholders to have an understanding of when the company starts setting targets and starts acting, those stakeholders have an understanding that the company is following the best practice in terms of risk assessment. And so again, it is focusing those efforts and those resources where they're most beneficial. So that's the WAVE methodology. And again, companies are required to go forward and seek the independent verification. Assuming a company achieves that independent verification, it's good for 2 years. The company gets a claim statement and a certificate and logo from SCS Global Services. They do the audit. Of course, the Water Council is not involved in that as a true third-party audit. And so again, that's good for 2 years. So just to kind of wrap up before I turn it over to Ed and hear more about the BlueTriton experience, just keep in mind, again, we've really been thoughtful in terms of how we created this program. We did not want to be duplicative of other efforts that were out there. And truly, there really isn't anything out there right now around verifying what constitutes, quote unquote, good corporate water stewardship, looking across the enterprise. We know what good water stewardship looks like at a site, at a facility, at a farm. And we know about commitments that CEOs and boards of directors make. But again, what's that strategic through line from that commitment all the way to the action at those sites? So it's complementary to existing platforms. Again, it's meant to be a foundation if you need it to start and build a water strategy, or if you're a company like BlueTriton and you've already got a water strategy or water targets and goals, be there as a continuous improvement process to help you as you update those on a periodic basis and report those to your stakeholders. While this program was not constructed to necessarily be an ESG specific or targeted effort, because of the data and the metrics that are required as companies go through this program, you will, as a company, gain the metrics and the data and the information that you can report through different ESG frameworks. And in fact, we feel having achieved the independent verification, kind of reporting that again through those frameworks can be beneficial for you. And then again, I kind of think last but not least, I keep talking about the importance of stakeholders. Give your stakeholders confidence. If you're a company considering WAVE, give your stakeholders confidence, again, that you're doing the necessary work to identify where you need to act, to mitigate actions, to address shared challenges and opportunities as it relates to water stewardship. So with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. For those of you that are interested in WAVE, I think Laura and the group are going to post some contact information at the end, but you can find all the information on this program at waveverified.com, all one word. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that level setting of water stewardship and certainly the introduction to the Water Council's WAVE program. And I think it's particularly interesting that the WAVE verification can support businesses regardless of where they are in their water stewardship journey, which sets us up nicely for our next speaker, which is Ed Ferguson, Chief Sustainability Officer at BlueTriton Brands. BlueTriton Brands is an American beverage company and has quite a portfolio of bottled water brands, such as Ice Mountain, Poland Spring, and Pure Life, just to name a few for those that aren't aware of the full portfolio. But they've made strong commitments to water stewardship and are one of the companies that, as Matt mentioned, is now using WAVE verification. So I'm pleased to introduce Ed. Ed is, as I mentioned, the Chief Sustainability Officer at BlueTriton Brands. A strategist and innovator, Ed combines his engineering background with an entrepreneurial spirit to deliver creative business opportunities for a better world. With over 10 years in the beverage industry, first at Anheuser-Busch and now with BlueTriton Brands, Ed has a robust background in manufacturing supply chains, innovation, and sustainability. His primary focus is to empower supply chains to adapt to the growing demands of today while also innovating for a better tomorrow and long-term sustainability. So Ed, thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to hearing about your efforts at BlueTriton and obviously the important topic of corporate water stewardship.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. Also appreciate everyone joining here today and those of you who watch this recording afterwards. Thank you for the time. This is such an important topic that, in my opinion, doesn't get the attention it deserves. So a little bit of background about myself. I actually grew up in Colorado and Idaho. So water has always been a central focus of my life, and that's really percolated into my career and long-term passion for water. So just a little bit about myself and my perspective. I generally like to think in systems. I'm an engineer, I'm an innovator. So my perspective is fairly pragmatic, but also inclusive of new ideas and innovations, and above all, focused on the betterment of the world. So a bit more about BlueTriton as well. So BlueTriton is, as Laura mentioned, it's a privately held bottled water company in both the US and Canada. We're in our infancy, just under 2 years old, but also built off of a legacy of brands that have been around for centuries. So brands like Poland Spring and Ice Mountains, as well as a portfolio across still, sparkling, flavored, and enhanced water beverages. So we account for about a fifth of the bottled water market in the US and a little less in Canada. But we source, produce, distribute waters across those two continents. And we have our enterprise includes over 6,000 employees, 28 production facilities, over 40 spring water sources, and 70 distribution sites. So we're involved in almost every leg of the supply chain and value chain of beverage. And then about 2/3 of our volume actually comes from spring sources. So slightly different than other beverage companies, and also slightly different than my history in the past, but plays a huge factor in the sustainability discussion today. So before I dive into more about BlueTriton and the topic here for this panel, I did want to address the elephant in the room. You may be asking yourself, what does a bottled water company have to say to me about sustainability? And well, we all know for-profit businesses share a common interest to do well, but businesses also have unique abilities to do good. And I'm here today to provide insight and context on how and why organizations acquired skills and knowledge can and should be directed to a common good in parallel to their pursuit of doing well as a business. So to get off, I wanted to start off with a story that came to my attention as I joined the organization, ties a few years back in Michigan. But it goes to how water systems can be intelligently designed with private entities and public entities and other community stakeholders. And it all begins with fireworks. So for those of you who don't know, fireworks are, by mass, they're about 30–35% perchlorate. And perchlorate is an item that has a propensity to get into watersheds and cause adverse health effects to humans if it's at high enough concentrations. And we had an instance a few years back where we had worked in the community, we're sourcing water from springs around there. And because of our presence and because of our monitoring wells around there, we actually detected a plume of perchlorate coming through the aquifer. It was a shallow aquifer close to surface, so surface contamination had basically a chance to get down to the water table at a fairly quick rate. So we saw this plume coming. We notified the city that was also sourcing water from about the same location that we were, and we identified where it was coming from, how big it was, how fast it was moving, and also directed a remediation plan. So ultimately, we discovered that the area of which fireworks were being lit off every year and the debris area of those fireworks coming back down was actually causing perchlorate to get into a plume or a source of contamination for the groundwater source. So we detected that, we notified, we very quickly worked with the stakeholders in the community to identify how we were going to address that plume and also address the long-term challenges there. And it ended up resulting in a remediation plan that lasted for a few years and basically cycled water out that was in that plume to make sure that that pollution didn't get into the drinking water for either our products or the community. And then also set up long-term controls to continuously monitor and also responsibly use fireworks, so they weren't necessarily going to be the contributor to a perchlorate plume in the future. So that story was eye-opening to me because perchlorate wasn't even on the radar of potential risks in that area, but the system of which was designed between ourselves and the local community had a capability to detect that unknown risk coming forward. And that's ultimately when you look at the skills and expertise of all your different stakeholders, figuring out how to piece them together to make a system that can address both known and unknown risks to the water we all rely on. So what I ultimately love about that story was it really shows how we can come together to build a resilient community in partnership because of shared interests, complementary capabilities, and mutual trust, which at the end of the day is reinforced through programs like WAVE or other third-party verification programs to be built on top. And if I look at kind of the takeaways from that story, the first one I really look at is the long-lasting problem that water can become a tragedy of the commons, a resource used by everyone, but the responsibility for its quality or quantity is disseminated across everyone as well. And it means that ultimately every living thing that is tied to the water can be put at risk through an individual's action, either intentional or not, but it's a realistic problem in the world. And in this instance, the fires were not an anticipated issue. It was something that both the community and BlueTriton had an interest in remediating and fixing, and we quickly jumped into action. And we're first of all notified by a robust and proactive system, which caught the issue and also directed intelligently how big the plume was and informed the remediation strategy, which effectively removed the risk. And in that instance, the feedback mechanism of water quality monitoring was critical to the system. There's systems in the world today, especially in rural communities, that don't necessarily have the opportunity to have robust groundwater monitoring systems. In this instance, we did because we had a shared interest in it, and we co-invested in building that feedback loop, which informed the action. The second major takeaway I take from that story or want to highlight is sustainability has a propensity to quickly become a game of finger pointing or long-term focus on a utopian society. And this story could have gone a different direction. It could have spiraled into a time-consuming game of, okay, who to blame? Do we ban fireworks? How do we build in perchlorate restrictions? Or some other long-term utopian focus, when in reality, action was needed now. So in this instance, the system worked very well because there was mutual trust between the parties involved here, and we're able to pragmatically jump into a solution that solved both short-term and long-term risk. And in the world we live today, there's dynamic constraints, and the world of water is the basis for all of life. And this creates an environment in which some stakeholders may decide to stay out of the topic because of the fear of the idiom of no good deed goes unpunished. And ultimately, creating a safe environment where partners with long-term and shared interests within a community can work together is paramount for the betterment of our world and communities. So let's find ways to work in a trusted manner together to ultimately achieve our shared vision of water quality, access, and availability everywhere that we live and operate. So beyond that story, I do want to transition back to BlueTriton's specific focus in water. I know I started a bit with the anecdote of the fireworks stories, but ultimately the areas that we're looking at is actions to improve water quality, availability, and access. And I know a lot of people will lump availability and access together, but for us, availability is availability for the broader environment, for other non-drinking water purposes, but access really ties to having what we critically need as humans and a lot of animals need, which is drinking water quality water. So those three areas are the main focus areas, but ultimately building a system of trust is the secondary component of our overall water stewardship strategy. And that includes checks and balances on those actions. We heavily endorse third-party verification and certification. This builds trust, innovation, and transparency, which fosters collaboration and more robust system building. And we have a goal to have our full enterprise verified, in addition to having each of our high-risk sites certified for water stewardship by 2025. And today, we've already gone above and beyond on our high-risk sites, and now we actually have 16 certified sites towards the AWS, or Alliance for Water Stewardship standard, with 9 of them achieving the platinum level, or the highest level of achievement. And then additionally, earlier this year, we formalized a commitment with the Water Council to also pursue and complete the WAVE verification for the full enterprise. So I'll wrap it up there because I do want to get into the panel discussion and see where that goes. And I'm very excited for the Q&A. I'm very grateful for those of you already filling in questions. Please, we're eager to hear from you as well throughout this. And with that, thank you again, and I'll pass it back to Laura.
Thank you, Ed. Really great to hear what BlueTriton is doing, delivering on its corporate responsibility, and particularly with water stewardship, and sharing that fireworks story as an example of how issues can come up that you might not be looking for. So great. So we have, I think, about 20 minutes left. So we'll go ahead and dive into the Q&A. And great, Matt is back now also. So Matt, I'll go ahead and start with you. You gave us a nice overview of water stewardship. Can you expand just a little bit more on what the value is for companies operating in the Great Lakes to prioritize water stewardship? I mean, especially given it's a water-rich region.
Well, I mean, I'm going to start with that last point. So I don't know if anyone has seen this recent article in ProPublica, which I don't know if it came out today or recently. Someone at the Water Council shared it with me today, but Jay Familietti, I think I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, used to be at NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratories. He's now up at the University of Saskatchewan. And anyway, came out with this interview today in ProPublica talking about, quite frankly, his fairly pessimistic view of what's happening with water resources in the West, and kind of introducing this idea that, maybe in the United States and other places globally, we should produce what we produce where we're currently producing it. So guess what? People are going to start looking north to the Great Lakes region in particular because of our relative water abundance. Of course, we have the compact, protecting, water resources within the basin itself. But nevertheless, getting to your specific question point, why should we care because we're located here? We should care because we're located here. And so, as companies operating in a water abundant region, or organizations operating in a water abundant region saying, we care about water resources, well, let's care about our abundant water resources, right? And so then we can go out and live that ethic outside the basin in other places where we operate, where water resources aren't abundant, regulations aren't as stringent, et cetera. And we can sort of build on the ethic that we built at home on water stewardship and go out and then live that and promote that, through our supply chain or through our partnerships with other organizations. So now, all of that being said, again, kind of back to one of my first points that I made, even though, again, we are located in this basin, there are still very significant water-related risks that companies face. And we know about the water quality issues, polluted stormwater runoff getting into the Great Lakes, legacy pollution issues in the Great Lakes themselves, fish advisories for trout and salmon being caught in Lake Michigan, for instance. So we got some pretty acute water quality issues that we need to pay attention to and that we really need to address here. The other thing to keep in mind too is, states like Wisconsin and Minnesota, for instance, being Great Lakes states, obviously a good portion of the state itself exists outside the Great Lakes Basin. And so just in terms of where I'm at in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you just go 5 miles to the west, you're in the Mississippi River Basin. And completely different, water-related issues and risks happening there, including drought and some issues of scarcity, depending on reliance on groundwater, for instance. So again, let's not have a false sense of security just because, we're seeing water nonstop, within the Great Lakes Basin. But that also gives us strength and credibility as we go out abroad and do water stewardship outside the basin too, that we're walking the talk. So that's kind of my call, to organizations, to companies, that are watching this webinar and that are generally located or operating here in the basin.
Yeah. And Ed, what is your take on this? I mean, as a beverage company, water is vital to your operations and products, and you've touched already on your role in water stewardship, but can you just, I guess, touch on, does your approach to stewardship vary based on the region that you're operating in? And is there a specific approach to stewardship within the Great Lakes region?
Okay, there's a couple of questions embedded
Yeah, there's
there.
a couple.
I'll start with the role of, well, our organization at least. It's going to be unique for whatever organization is using water. But ultimately, when we talk about water, the responsibility and action, it ties back to the quality, availability, and access. And for us across our supply chain, it starts with spring sources. So spring sources are basically when groundwater starts hitting surface water and then sourcing water from that area, making sure that local environment is monitored for quality, availability, and access, and ensure that through boreholes with monitoring that basically track water that's feeding down the watershed or down the groundwater basin, and ultimately tracks the level, the quality metrics, and then externally where it surfaces, measuring biodiversity for things like fish population. So there's a responsibility there of taking a resource out, even though it is renewable and recharges with rainfall, making sure you're doing it in a way that's long-term sustainable for the environment in the local spring area. Because ultimately, we're not there to deplete a spring source. If we do, we run ourselves out of business. It's a shared interest with the community. We want long-term, stable, high-quality access and availability to water. So that starts at the spring sites through the actions I just mentioned. And then when you go downstream, when that water hits an operation, operations need to effectively or efficiently use water and consume as little as they can for anything not going into the product itself. So that ties into everything from reusing water or selecting the right quality of water for the right activity. There's a lot of pieces within operations that we can do to both control water waste and promote reuse in applications like utilities and other parts of the operation that may not need like spring water coming in. You can use reuse water from the other places in the plants. Then the third piece beyond the springs, the operations, is going to be the communities in which we sell. So that's the entire US and Canada population when we're talking communities. It is a collective group, but it is also hyper local. And when we look at communities, specifically in the ones that we're working at, if they're working with us on water for our products, we need to make sure that community is thriving. And we've, like in Michigan specifically, we've created like the Ice Mountain Environmental Stewardship Fund, which has been going on for 20 years. So predates a lot of the certification and verification work. But we saw a need of, hey, this community deserves a higher level of investment than what necessarily comes out in taxes and other benefits from our business being there. So we created that Environmental Stewardship Fund so groups can come to us along with other stakeholders that are on that leadership team to assess, okay, well, which projects make sense every year to invest in. And then the other thing is collaboration for those communities in times of need. We need water on only a few days you can go without water, and supply chains of water get disrupted, whether it's hurricanes, infrastructure failure, et cetera. You need a reliable, redundant water access plan that can respond quickly with safe drinking water. And we step in a lot of those instances. Some of the like odd one-offs are like during COVID, we had distilled water capability. All of a sudden we could donate that water to hand sanitizer producers who couldn't hit capacity. That's one example. The other one is a more obvious safety net for drinking water, of donating water when a community encounters a crisis. So for Flint, we've been donating water to that city in the magnitude of over 50 tons a week since 2016. So that amount of water is necessary for areas that don't have quick fixes to their existing long-term infrastructure. And then the third part is access to that existing long-term infrastructure. So on our part, another example in Michigan was we actually put in a hand pump like well for water for people for recreational purposes at a local park we sponsored. And unbeknownst to us, when the electricity went out in that community, water access was dependent on pumps running that water to these houses. So they didn't have something. So this hand pump all of a sudden had a line of people filling up their buckets with it so they could go home, boil it, sanitize or whatever, because it wasn't designed for drinking water, but provided infrastructure that again was another fallback plan. So across springs, operations, and communities are where our role is. Other organizations are going to have varying levels of that. For us, springs is much bigger than someone else because a lot of beverage companies or other manufacturers just use municipal water. So they don't get as involved in the upstream stewardship of where the water is actually coming from. Whereas since 2/3 of our water is from springs, we have a very large footprint there. And then beyond the action is checks and balances, making sure we're doing what is appropriate in this highly dynamic space. So that's where verification under WAVE or certification for sites under Alliance for Water Stewardship comes into play to make sure we are up to date with evolving stakeholder needs or the changing climate around water or new information on new like water health risks or pollution risks. So constantly evolving and keeping yourself up to date on the very dynamic world of water is another huge component that organizations have a responsibility to stay on top of. So the other piece, so getting to how it specifically applies to Michigan, I kind of peppered a couple examples throughout there, but ultimately water is a hyperlocal issue. And Matt highlighted this earlier. There's a side of water sustainability world that focuses on the hyperlocal components, but then there's also the focus on the organizational wide governance, policies, directives that lead the overall organization. But on a hyperlocal level within Michigan, our Mecosta plant is our largest plant in the region, and it sources from 3 spring water sources on the Muskegon River. And ultimately in that site, we partner with a number of local organizations, but one specifically is going to be on the water data side. There's not too much groundwater data, but we are gathering groundwater data because our water is where groundwater hits surface water. So we have data on both sides. So sharing that with like the USGS and local other local community groups on what's happening within the water better informs the community and informs us of the spring health and longevity. So having those local partners that can use the data to do good things outside of what we're doing in the organization is another huge component of water stewardship, because a lot of water stewardship is data deprived, and getting tied into those systems, whether it's local or national like the USGS, and providing data to inform better decision making for the future is huge. So that's kind of high level some of what I see organizational responsibility, as well as some hyperlocal examples within Michigan.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, your point on the data, it's so important to have that data, and see, measuring is not always easy. So I guess, measuring and understanding one's water impact isn't exactly easy. So I guess, Matt, I'll sort of turn it over to you, of sort of touching on best practice. Are there any best practices that you have found that really stand out in helping companies address their water use and minimize impact? And I guess sort of understanding how that measuring isn't always easy, sort of. So yeah, I guess, so on the best practice.
Right, yeah. So, I probably thought about this question a little bit too much, and I decided to kind of back up and take it from this angle, which is, to borrow a phrase and not to be too cute, to thine own self be true. And when it comes to water, organizations and companies need to have a true understanding of how water is material to their operations. Based on that materiality, how do they use and impact water resources? Based on that, do the watershed-based risk assessment. Based on that, and all that context, then determine what the suite of appropriate best practices are to address your very specific situation, whether that's water quality, water quantity, you got regulatory challenges or reputational issues. So I think, one of the things that I keep alluding to when I'm doing webinars like this or having conversations with companies is the fact that because carbon is so important right now, and it is, and GHG reductions are critically important, we have to do those. But unfortunately, people are bringing carbon and GHG reduction framework or mindset to water. And you have to bring a different analytical lens to water. And it goes back to that statement, to thine own self be true. You have to really start with that materiality assessment. You really have to understand, again, where water lives within your operation, where risk lives within your operation, your supply chain, your value chain. And then based on those assessments, then organizations like ours and others can point you in the right direction for the suite of best practices, right, that address those specific risks. Mm-hmm. So in terms of then, if I can actually give you an actual best practice, it's a process-based approach. We think the WAVE program is a best practice using a process-based approach that leads to continuous improvement. Again, because water conditions change year over year. They're seasonal anyway, and then given climate change and what's happening, right, those conditions are going to continue to change year over year. And so you're going to need to do or put into place some method or system for doing assessment, review and update, strategy review and update, new target and goal setting, new reporting. So it's going back to really knowing how water is important to your organization. And I know, again, because and I think this is great that we're seeing a lot of new companies start making water goals and commitments. Again, companies outside food and beverage and kind of the usual suspects of water intensive sectors. That's critical. We need everybody at the table, and we want these companies coming, to water stewardship and building those water strategies. But we do want them to understand that even if it's not obvious that they're water intensive, water risk probably lives somewhere within their operations or their supply chain. So it's worth doing these types of assessments to figure out where that risk might reside and what they can do to mitigate it, and then more importantly, to work with others to address common shared challenges and opportunities that may exist around that issue that's driving the risk.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so that's kind of the best practice. I mean, we can certainly go down different rabbit holes on water quality and water quantity, but again, because water is such a unique issue when it comes to the environment or sustainability issues at large, you really got to start from that point of materiality and then work your way through those assessments to action.
Yeah, that's great. And it seems that BlueTriton has really done that assessment and that best practice in terms of sort of evaluating. So Ed, how has, in terms of technology, are there any sort of innovations, best practices that you've used at BlueTriton or implemented into your operations to improve your water footprint and water stewardship? And I'm just sort of curious to understand where that's played a role for you.
Yeah, so there's a couple different pieces, but I did want to go back to one of Matt's points of verification and certification activities being a machine for continuous improvement. It's imperative to have your overall organization's mission defined, what your overall goals are, and then ultimately use these deep dives and hyperlocal analyses around your sites to understand how it's operationalized. Because ultimately each site's going to have unique needs, whether it's the spring feeding a local production site or the production site then taking it downstream in a packaged good to a distribution site. Each one has very unique differences, even across comparable springs. So understanding the local context is a really important component, whether you're ready for certification or verification. Like, that's something you should be doing anyways. Have conversations with local stakeholders of what are some of the concerns around like our water usage or this region, whether it's quality, availability. Can really open your eyes up to both the contextual and the physical risks tied to water in that region, which can inform your larger technologies or partnerships that you bring forth for the betterment of the community and the water stability, basically water access, availability, and quality stability to the region. And then the other component is using that same type of framework of deep diving into a water map of your operations. So first start off with your community, the local environment, do a map of the issues, challenges, and then put forth a strategy to solve towards that. Then for your sites, do the same thing. Do the water mapping exercise of where's water used, what type of water, like what are the quality specs for those different pieces of your operations, and then build a plan to reduce. So in getting to specific technologies for us, we identified within our own water map, a lot of water goes to utility work. Utility work is work that doesn't hit our product, but it's items that like, go into running your electrical systems, heat systems, not electrical, in your facilities, and ultimately identifying, well, we don't need a certain level of quality water for that. We can take water that's coming off of our processes, reverse osmosis it or nanofilter it to get it to a quality where it's not going to junk up the machinery. But that way you're not using water coming into the facility, you're reusing water that's been discarded from operations for that. So that's been a big enabler for us to decrease our water usage, because ultimately the lowest you can theoretically ever go is like 1 liter of water going into 1 liter of like bottled water sold. And ultimately getting there is a roadmap of all the different things you can do, and reuse was a big technology for us. Others is with growing AI and visual capabilities within operations. doing monitors on overfills. You don't want bottles bubbling over with water when you're filling it and that going into your collection system. You want to fill the bottled water up to what the capacity is for it, and not above and beyond the neck of the bottle, which results in more water waste. So improve technologies to pinpoint when a filler head or filler valve is acting inappropriately, or your fills are off spec, using AI and optics to really dive into when those problems are coming up and where the source of the issue is, leads to faster and even proactive troubleshooting to control water waste within the operation. So everyone uses water differently, but the growth of capabilities in optics and AI is a huge way to apply technology to your major water uses within your own water map or your operations to understand sources, and also when issues or unanticipated issues arise, it can help you problem solve and continuously improve to drive it lower and lower every year. The other component is innovation outside of your business. So when you talk to the communities about needs, making sure there's ways to facilitate that action. So I brought up the Ice Mountain Environmental Stewardship Fund because that is designed not for one specific issue. It's designed to be a platform for the community's evolving issues to find funding outside of traditional pathways. So it's something that is designed based off of conversation with communities to ultimately understand that a system needed to be built to address the evolving needs with ourselves, which can also lead to more funding. So an example there was analyzing dams back in 2021 on the Muskegon River. There hadn't been an inventory update since the 1980s. And there's a group that's like, we want to update this. Then once we funded and the work was done to do that update and inventory of those dams, then they use that information to then go and seek additional funding, some of it from federal government, to ultimately lead towards dam removal. So that's a community innovation, not necessarily within your processes, but the certification and verification work kind of forces that type of conversation to occur, so you can understand, oh, we do these types of things internally. Why don't we repurpose this same framework to work with communities and address their evolving needs? So there's innovations on both fronts, fed from continuous improvement, from verification and certification work.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm just noticing the time. We only have a couple minutes left. So unfortunately, we're not getting to all of the questions because we've got so many more. But I do want to end with one final question, because you touched again on the verification and how that supported what the assessment of this for you at BlueTriton. So I guess on the last question for you would be how does WAVE or verifications like WAVE fit into your water stewardship efforts, but also, and you've touched on that, but then also how do you communicate that to your stakeholders in terms of validating and that credibility that comes with verification?
I mean, this ties back to the ESG reporting world, and ultimately what Matt compared the water space, or when Matt compared the water space to carbon. There's a propensity to oversimplify in the ESG space of, oh, we want to say net zero, like water neutral, whatever, kind of mimicking the carbon space, because that's the most mature sustainability platform in terms of environmental. And understanding that that is not necessarily appropriate for water because the issues are so hyper local, but then also understanding, well, what are the things we can do across the entire portfolio to ensure that we are adjusting and addressing the hyperlocal issues? And that's where WAVE really comes in, is when you're looking at like the enterprise-wide, how the organization is empowered to act both with its communities and external stakeholders, making sure those processes are established is reinforced by WAVE, because ultimately we're not aware of the best practices. Like the beverage companies or even other manufacturers talk a lot, but we don't necessarily get into the depth. Someone like the Water Council and the WAVE certification has the opportunity to look both nationally and globally at best practices on how organizations really build an environment for fostering water stewardship, and then builds that into their expectations or their verification. So it's a way to bring best practices to us, so we're not constantly sourcing what those best practices may be. So that's the verification side of thing, how it fits in, is it helps quantify what your organization is doing and keeps your strategies fresh and relevant to the evolving world of water stewardship. And then to the point of certification or site-specific work, that's where you get into the local context of understanding, like, okay, in this region, drought is much more probable. What are the things we can do to help on the drought front? Or in this area, like legacy industrial chemicals are an issue. Like, how do we address that or get ahead of it? And each of those hyperlocal questions is facilitated by mandatories in the certification process, which require you to engage with external stakeholders, talk with them about what they're seeing in the watershed, what their primary concerns are, and maybe even the data systems informing them or the lack thereof. But it helps you identify what the hyperlocal issues are and what are the missing components in a system. And when I say a system, I mean aligned mission and goals, unified or aligned guide rails and rules of activation, and then feedback loops. How do you inform yourself when you're not working towards that mission? And when there's a component missing in that equation, the certification work helps you unearth where that missing component is, so then your strategy can focus on building that capability, either by yourself or with external stakeholders, but then ultimately in the collaboration of everyone. So the world of verification and certification is paramount for ESG reporting, and also just building a robust sustainability water stewardship program to address both the enterprise-wide broad organizational enablement and the hyperlocal problem and solution identification.
Great. Well, thank you, Ed, for answering that final question. I'm sorry, this hour has gone by very quickly, and that is all the time we have left. But thank you, Ed, and thank you, Matt, for sharing your expertise on advancing water stewardship. You were fantastic guests and definitely provided a wealth of information. I know I've learned a lot from both of you this past hour, and I'm sure many of our audience did as well. And to our audience, thank you today for your questions. Again, I'm sorry that we were not able to get through all of them, but I appreciate the engagement. I do encourage you to sign up for the council's mailing list to stay informed of other webinars. We have one coming up next month on circular economy in the Great Lakes. And if you would like to get involved in our work and learn more about how you can get involved in Great Lakes WISE, or would like more information on the Water Council's WAVE program, we would be happy to direct you to more information. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and really appreciate you joining us today.